Welcome back to the IE427 garage, everybody. This week what I'd like to concentrate my efforts on is getting the cooling system wrapped up. And I'd also like to dive into the dash harness portion of the Ron Francis harness. So as I said, what I'd like to start on today is to get all of the cooling system pretty much finished up. I will still have two hoses as far as the cooling system, and those are right here, that I probably won't finish in this week's video. And that's simply because I've still got to put all of the panels back in over here to see where I can find some space to mount our valve. So this is basically a thermotion bypass valve, and it's needed on the Coyote basically to recirculate the coolant back to the engine so that it cools properly, because we're using it when it's going through the heater to act as a bypass from one head, cylinder head, to the other head, and not overheat either one of the heads. So this has to go in place. There are other valves that you can use in place of the thermotion that are just a strict, like heater bypass. This one is actually going to tie in to our AC system, and the AC system is going to determine by temperature when this is free flow to the heater core and when it is bypassed back to the engine. So we need to have this in with the Coyote because they have a tendency to overheat one of the heads if you don't have the bypass in place. If you're not running a heater and you're using the Coyote motor, basically what you're going to do is you're going to take that side port from the head to this side port of the head, the one that I shortened, and you're going to put a restrictor in line. It basically takes that 3/4 or 5/8 hose down to about 1/4 of an inch. There's a reducing bushing basically that you put inside the hose, and it just restricts the flow. It's basically there just to slow the coolant down enough that you get equal temperature between the two sides of the head. When it's running in bypass on that valve, it'll essentially do the same thing. When it's running to the heater core, it's going to be open full, and just the effect of it running through the heater core allows the coolant more time before it goes back to the other cylinder head. So I guess this is the way that Ford has designed it. In other engines, earlier engines, all of the bypassing was done at the actual water pump. So like on a small block Ford or even a small block Chevy, if I remember correctly. And because this is a dual overhead cam engine, they've decided that this is a more effective way to keep the engine at the temperature, the proper temperature that they want it to run at. So I've got to get that in place, and that'll probably be the only thing that I won't finish up today. So what I'm trying to work on is to get all of the Gates power grip clamps in place. So I still have one at the radiator at the bottom. I've got two at the water inlet next to the water pump, and then I've got one down on the outside of the radiator tunnel that goes into our cooling tube. And then I've got a bypass from the engine to the surge tank, which I have to install a spring in, and that's simply to keep the hose from collapsing because of the angle that I was forced to install the hose at. And In previous builds, what I've used is I've just used a piece of 3/4 inch heater hose from the bypass on the front of the engine to the surge tank, and it works just fine. This customer had this Ford hose that is designed to work with the Mustang, I think for a 2019 Mustang, to the surge tank, and it would work perfectly if this was a Roadster, because it actually pushes the surge tank farther forward in the engine bay. But since we're working on a coupe, it kind of puts it back towards the motor a little bit, and so the hose doesn't fit perfectly. And the inner spring is made of stainless steel, so it won't rust or corrode or anything like that, but it's stiff enough so that it won't allow that hose to collapse, and so we'll still get full flow through it. So come right back, and I'm gonna work on getting all of those things in the car. I'll probably have it up in the air, and then I'll show you exactly how I got the hoses installed. We are under the car now, and you can see this hose right here from the bottom of the surge tank, how it kind of loops down and out and then up. Right in here, right at this 90, right here, the hose was wanting to collapse because of the angle that it's been installed in the car. And so what I did is I inserted a stainless steel, they call them an inner spring, coolant hose spring. And I inserted what is essentially a 5/8/3/4 inch inner hose spring. And now you cannot collapse that hose. So if I can, I don't know if I can reach up there, right here, I can press on this in it, and it's hard. And that's the nature of that spring. It just won't allow the hose to collapse. The hose actually will keep that spring in place because of the way it is in tension, because of the bend in it. The hose has nowhere to go. It can't move because the actual hose, the inside of the rubber hose, is holding it in place. I also got the clamp, the power grip clamp, installed on this side, and it was difficult trying to get my heat gun, which is not small, in there to get that thing heated up and then evenly heated, because you don't want to overheat it all in one area. It was difficult. I had to get it up in here, and then I had to come in from the other side and get in from here, and then I had to go to the top, and I had to get in from the top over here. It was a little bit difficult to get that in, but we managed to get it in. It's all clamped down tight right now, and it's ready to go. This one right here, what we decided to do, let's see, get the light over here. So this clamp right here, we're using just a standard breeze clamp, and that's, there's many different names they call these. Spiral clamp. We've just always called them breeze clamps because that's the company that makes them. I put a standard breeze clamp here simply because it would have been difficult to get a power grip clamp removed from this spot. You'd really have to be, you'd really have to just figure that you're going to replace this section of hose if you had to cut this one loose. So in this instance, I just decided that a spiral clamp would be best, the breeze clamp, because it would give us an easy way to get this hose apart. As difficult as it will be to get this power grip clamp, which is right here, out, and this is the lower radiator hose coming out of there, we can still get to it both from the bottom here and from the top. And so I figured we'd give this a chance, see if it works. The problem that I'm having with this one is that I couldn't get the clamp in any farther because of that weld bead right there. And so the bead is like midway on that clamp where it's supposed to be closer to the end. So we're gonna have to see how this one works out. If need be, I can cut that power grip clamp off and I can just go back and put a breeze clamp on there and hopefully have it tighten from the bottom here so that it's less conspicuous. But that's done. While we're down here, I went ahead and I finished up the clutch. So the clutch slave cylinder has been in for a while, but I had not been able to find the push rod. And it was one of those things where I figured, well, eventually it'll turn up because we had the rest of the clutch kit here. And as luck would have it, I just happened to open a box and I saw a plastic bag, a small plastic bag with the turnbuckle in it. And so I grabbed the turnbuckle and I put it over on the blue toolbox right there. And as I was going through some of the hardware, I found this bolt with this nut on it. And this is the push rod. And what kind of reminded me about how this push rod is made, it's essentially just a 5/16 bolt that has the head cut off, and then it has fine threads on it. And I found this bolt with this nut on it with no head, and I thought, well, that's got to be our push rod. And sure enough, I pulled it out of the box, I put it over with the rod end over on the blue toolbox, and I got back to it, and sure enough, it's exactly what I was looking for. But why they were in two different locations, I have no idea. But as you guys now know, a lot of the hardware that we got with this car was just strewn all over in different boxes, if we even had them. So on this one, I was just patient. I knew I could get the parts or make the parts if I had to, but luckily everything showed up. This part here where the turnbuckle goes in, or the rod end goes in, had been attached to the clutch arm when we got the kit. So I knew where that was because it had already been on here. The fittings we had, I just needed this adapter fitting here, which I pulled out of stock. The bleeder screw was on it. The one mistake I made, and if you go back to last week's video, I told you I put fluid in the reservoirs, is when I did that, I never checked to see if the bleed screw for the clutch slave cylinder had been tightened down. And so I came in the next morning and there was a puddle of brake fluid on the ground. It wasn't enormous, but it was big enough to tell me exactly what I had done. And so I went up in there with a wrench and I tightened the bleed screw down. The clutch is essentially bled right now. We will bleed it with the power bleeder and get out any residual air, but just the effect of leaving the bleeder screw opened overnight bled our clutch for us. So there's really just a little bit of fine tuning left and our clutch is ready to go. The other thing I did was I filled the transmission. So if you have never filled a manual transmission before, I'll walk you through it. So right here is the drain. This will drain all of the fluid out of your transmission from this port right here. There is a 3/8 drive socket in, basically, that you just put your ratchet wrench in and you back that out. The Tremec transmissions all come with thread sealant on the threads of the drain and the fill port when you get the transmission. They are not screwed in all the way. They are not tight. They're just snug enough that any residual fluid that they use during the installation process will not drain out. This is the fill plug up here. If your transmission is in the car and you have already installed your tunnel top or your tunnel cover, this is where you're going to fill it from. You're going to fill it to the point where the fluid just starts to come out of it, and then that's when you put the plug back in. What we did is I had to install one missing bolt for our shifter because I had gone to the hardware store. I had gotten bolts, but I had mistakenly pulled one out of the bin that had the 5/16 flange head bolts, and somebody had inadvertently put another size bolt in there. I just counted that I needed 6, put 6 in my bag, checked out, and left. It wasn't until I got back to the shop that I realized one of the bolts was wrong. So I had to put another bolt in. Since I knew I had to do that, it was just easier to fill the transmission through the top, right through the shifter opening. So I pulled the shifter out of the car. I pulled the fill plug out of the car, and then I filled it with a drain pan underneath it until fluid started draining basically out of the transmission through the fill plug. Then I ran the fill plug in, I put the shifter back in with all 6 bolts, and we're good to go. One last note here. I got a lecture not too long ago about what fluid I should run in this. And if you read the instructions that came with the transmission, they're very vague. However, on the side of this transmission, which is a it's a T56 Magnum, it clearly states Dextron 3 fluid only. It does not say MTF. It does not say any other manufacturer or any different type. So this got Dextron 3 in it. Now, I'm not saying that you can't use the Tremec MTF fluid. What I'm saying is that that's what it says on the transmission. That's what we installed. If at some point in the future, after it's broken in, which again, Tremec is very vague on what the break-in period is, the owner can drain the fluid and he can refill it with MTF if he chooses to. Onto the rear end. One more thing that I would have done differently. Generally, when I put the rear end in, not too long after, I will fill the rear end, especially when it's an IRS, simply because you're not going to be pulling the axles out because it has axle stubs, and it's really easy to fill it at that point because usually none of the sheet metal in the trunk is in, or the trunk area, and it just makes it really easy to fill. Now, this rear end does have a drain at the bottom, like the transmission, and it has a fill port up here. You want to go ahead, pull the fill port out, and you want to add fluid until it drains out of there. I did go on to the website for the rear end. This is a Ford 88, and it is the SN 550 platform. And so what it says is that it wants W75-85 fluid. However, it says you can also use a W75-140 fluid. And as far as the friction modifier, if the friction modifier is already in the fluid that you're using, it calls for full synthetic. If the friction modifier is already in the fluid, it does not require friction modifier. If the fluid does not have the friction modifier in it already, it suggests to add an entire tube, which I believe is 2.5 ounces, into the rear end. You want to do that first before you add the rest of the fluid, because what you don't want to do is put too much fluid in and then not have enough space for the friction modifier. So you always want to add your friction modifier first and then top it off with the standard fluid so that the friction modifier is in their full strength when you fill it up. We've got the fluid on order. I also gave the car owner a choice on what coolant he wanted to run in this. If it was the Mustang or the F-150, it would require the Motorcraft yellow coolant, but at this point the car hasn't been started. We could run any coolant we wanted in the car, and then he would just have to make sure he used the same fluid from that point on. Let me lower the car down. We'll take a look at the coolant hose, the return coolant hose from the radiator, and then I think we'll jump into the dash harness, because I'm going to start ripping that apart and separating some of the wires that are in there. Right here you can see the power grip clamp that we've got on this hose right here. This is the last 90 going into the water pump, and then we've got our power grip clamp here at the top. These went on really nice. I like the look of the power grip clamps. We'll see long term, since I've never used these on a car, how they work out. I'm hoping for the best, but planning for the worst. We'll have to see how that goes. The coolant system, engine-wise, is all wrapped up now. So I can give you a peek in the radiator tunnel as well. And you can see down here that power grip clamp is in as well. So right here, that power grip clamp is all finished up. Like I said, these came out really, really nice. I like the look, of these clamps on our cooling system, because they just help to clean everything up. I am working on getting the fan hooked up. So these are the wires for the fan. If you'll notice, this is a number 10 ground that I've got right here, and I've got a number 10 for our feed wire. And I upped those when we were planning to use the Ford fan. The fan that we've got here doesn't pull quite as much power. I have tested the fan. The fan blows well. I mean, it really pulls air through the radiator, so I'm impressed with that. we've got the connector that'll have to go onto here, and then I'll join those. The connector and everything will probably be right over here in this location. However, what I did out here to get that number 10 ground is I ended up welding a ground stud onto the chassis right here. And after I was done, I masked this off. I touched it up with some paint. You can see it matches the powder coat pretty well. The only spot where you can see where I actually have a line is like right under this right here. And I purposely did it there because I knew it would be hidden. This ground stud, what it does, it gives us a secondary ground for our headlights. If you look at your Ron Francis harness going out to the front of the car, it's essentially a number 14 ground from the chassis derived ground point that they have you do underneath the dash. We ended up welding a stud on. So ours is a stud right here. And rather than just relying on a Tech screw. But that 14 gauge wire is not large enough, in my opinion, to run the headlights and the fan. The wire supplying the fan is a 14 gauge, which I think is questionable, because in many instances that fan that's supplied with the factory 5 kit can draw up to 30 amps, and a number 14 wire is too small for a 30 amp load. So what we've done here is we've actually taken that chassis ground that comes from underneath the dash, or next to the dash as we have it. We've landed it here along with a ground, a number 10 ground, that's this one here, to the fan that goes through this opening. And then we've taken another 14 gauge wire out to the front of the car that comes to here, and that's going to be strictly for our headlights. So we've added a redundant ground to the front of the car that I believe we should have. At the very minimum, I think what Ron Francis should do is they should run a number 10 for the cooling fan, and they should run a number 10 ground out to the front of the car, just to make everything a little bit more within the margin, because I think we're outside of the margin for the amp draw, especially if the fan were to come on while you're driving at night. That's putting an awful big burden on a number 14 ground. So we've got that taken care of, and I think what I'm going to do tomorrow is I'm going to dive into this harness. Now you can see our connectors for our gauges are already here on this side. The water is going to be fine. The fuel to the back will be fine. The one that we're going to have to work on is this one for the oil pressure, because this needs to be a 3-pin connector, and this is only a 2. And then some of the others, like we don't need anything for the speedo. This one is just for the voltage gauge. This one here, the purple one, is for our tachometer, which we do need, but we're going to tie our tech in a little bit different than I described earlier. So we're going to take this harness completely apart, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the headlights, which are right here. Where's the other one? There should be 3 wires. Here they are. These 3 wires, I'm going to take this entire group of wires and its connector, which is over here, out. And I'm going to make it separate. And then the rest of the stuff will pretty much stay intact, other than a little bit of dieting here and there. I'm going to try to make it to where we have a dedicated ground for each of the 2 gauges. So for the water temperature gauge and for the oil pressure, I want to make sure we have a separate ground through this group of wires to the dash, so that there's no chance of any interference. Oh, one last thing while we're here. I got the ground for our alternator all taken care of. So if you look here, they supply this nice ground stud that has a 5/16 bolt in it. So I put a 5/16 eyelet on a short piece of number 4 wire with some heat shrink. I in turn put another 5/16 eyelet on the other side with heat shrink, and that, I believe, is an M8 bolt running into the side of the block where there was a basically drilled and tapped hole. So now we have the appropriate size ground as the alternator manufacturer wanted. And we shouldn't have any problems with our alternator. All right, it's the next day, everybody. I really don't want to put this at the end of the video because the analytics say that 70% of you have already checked out of the video by now. But you know what? For those that checked out of the video, they're going to miss out on this information, and that's just too bad. As you're assembling your Ron Francis harness, make sure as you're plugging these connectors in that the light color wires are going to the light color wires. As a for instance, make sure the red on this side of the connector goes to a red on the other side of the connector, that the brown goes to the brown, the black goes to the black. When you get into some of these more complicated connectors that have multiples of the same color wire, you might have to dig in a little bit deeper to make sure that the green that is for the turn signal hasn't mistakenly been pinned to the cooling fan control. It's very important that you do this because on every Ron Francis harness that I've ever received, at least one of the connectors has been pinned wrong. The other things that I've had wrong in the past with the Ron Francis harness are that the wires haven't been crimped into the connector going into the back of a fuse. You want to basically just give a light tug on each one of the wires going into the back of your fuse block to make sure none of them are loose. If they are, immediately put that wire back into the pin and then use your stake-on tool to crimp that and make sure that it's going to be held in place. You can also solder those in if you'd like. So you can take a little bit of soldering paste, put it inside the connector, put a little bit on the wire, insert the wire back in, and then touch your soldering iron to the connector and then melt some solder in it. I've never had to go that far where I've had to solder them, but I have had to re-crimp them in the back of the fuse block before. So I'm going to try every time I do some type of electrical that has to do with the Ron Francis harness to repeat that. So hopefully those guys that tuned out early on this video can see it a little earlier in a video some other time. But it's so important. I've seen so many people plug these things in and then their whole electric system, when they go to put power to it for the first time, is doing all kinds of shit it's not supposed to. So make sure that you check those connectors before you plug them in. Now last night before I went in the house, I did separate the headlight portion of the harness right here from the rest of the harness, and you'll see it's actually got 3 wires plus. So this brown wire where it connects to your toggle switch to toggle in between the high and low beams has a tail off of it. And what that tail is that's to go to your high beam indicator in your gauges. So if you have the Speed Hut gauges, there will be a place for you to tie this brown wire in right here to the gauge so that when you put your high beams on, the indicator light will come on the dash, and you'll be able to remember you need to turn them off for oncoming traffic. We're going to, because this is a coupe, and because I'm not going to probably be mounting the switch in the spot that Factory 5 suggests, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to plug this in right here. And it's not going to be part of our actual, see now I almost did a Ron Francis there and plugged it in the wrong way. We're going to put the headlight switch probably just in a location where I think it's going to look and work the best. So we're just going to keep this separate. I could, by all means, I could just cut this off right here and eliminate the connector, but I'm probably going to need the length depending on where I mount this. So that's where it's going to kind of reside for now. On the rest of this harness over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start getting rid of all of the excess. So our gauges don't need all these pigtails, right? There's, I think, 2 or 3 pigtails. So there's one here, there's one here, and there's one on the end for your dash lights. We only need one. We only need to tie into the dash lights on the Speed Hut gauges on our particular one in one space or one place, because we have a series of plugs that are daisy chained together for our gauges. Remember, our gauges are 4 years old. maybe 5 years old. And so they're not what the latest Ron Francis gauges are coming with, which are those little, what do they call those things? Wago connectors, which I work in the electrical field, and I'm not a fan of Wago connectors. So I would do it a different way if I had those connectors supplied with my kit, but we'll leave that right there for now. I don't need to get into a big discussion about that. Anyways, we're gonna diet out everything in this dash harness that we don't need. And you don't have to do that with your build, but for whatever you don't need, if you end up having a connector, such as this, like I'm just using this as an example, but this is for your hazard lights. If you had a connector like this with a metal end on it, you're going to have to do something to safe it off if you don't use it, because you don't want that to come in contact with a ground source and then pop a fuse. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through that harness probably tonight and tomorrow night. I'm going to eliminate everything out of there that I don't need and just kind of clean it up. And then I'm going to go ahead and wire in the harness for our oil pressure sensor, because we have to go from that 2-pin connector that's in this harness to a 3-pin connector that is basically going to work with our gauge and our sending unit. So that's where I'm at with that dash harness right now. I think that's where I'm going to leave this one. If you guys are enjoying the content here, as always, please do the like, the share, the subscribe, all that kind of stuff. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.